So we're going to get started. For everyone who is tuned in, thank you again. And thank you, Raquel and Writers Atelier, for inviting me to do this. So tonight I'm going to read a few pages from my new book, The Monsters We Make. It just released a little over a week ago. It was originally supposed to come out in June, and then of course because of the pandemic, the publication date got bumped to August. And then the day before it was set to officially launch, the Midwest, Iowa, had this massive storm, which was pretty much the equivalent of a land hurricane. So this has been one of the rockiest book launches I've ever had. All right, so I'm going to start off by reading the short prologue of the book, and then kind of the short chapter 1. And after that, I'm just going to read and kind of answer some of the questions as you post them in the chat. We'll see how that goes. Talking and reading sometimes at the same time for me is a little challenging. We'll go with it. All right. So I'm reading from The Monsters We Make. This is a 1980s family drama that follows the disappearance of two paperboys from a small Midwestern capital of Des Moines, and the devastating effects that the disappearances have on a single mother, her two children, and a local cop. And it was inspired by the real-life Des Moines paperboy abductions of Johnny Gosch in September of 1982, Eugene Martin in August of 1984, and then a lesser-known third case of a boy named Mark Warren Allen in March of 1986, just a few blocks away from where Eugene Martin went missing. Okay, so I'm going to start with the prologue. Sunday, July 18th, 1982. It started with a boy and a wagon. He left his spacious white brick home shortly before sunrise in darkness. A humid Iowa morning, dewdrops clung to blades of grass. The manicured West Des Moines neighborhood was still drowsy, quiet. He towed an empty red wagon with his faithful corgi, Lucy, trotting alongside him. He walked at an easy pace, occasionally passing through the pale yellow circles of dimming streetlights. Sleepiness tugged at his eyelids. Shortly before 6 a.m., he reached the corner where he waited for his newspaper bundles to be dropped off. He was only 12 years old, but took his paper route seriously. In a sales contest the year before, he finished second and won the red wagon. This year, he wanted the grand prize, an 8-track tape player. Within a few minutes, the delivery van arrived, and the driver unloaded the boy's bundles of the Des Moines Register. The van pulled away, and the boy started rolling and binding the papers with rubber bands. As he worked, a dark blue car stopped at the corner. A man asking how to get to the mall. Strange, the boy thought, because the mall wouldn't open for several hours. But he did his best to give directions. It's that way, he pointed, on Valley West Drive. The exchange lasted mere minutes, and the man in the blue car left. The boy returned to his task and finished rolling. He set out on his route, pulling his now full wagon, Lucy, at his side. Streetlights sputtered out against the rising sun. A car door slammed. An engine revved. Lucy barked for a few moments, then stopped. The neighborhood returned to silence. As the tip of the sun peaked above the horizon, the boy was gone. In the blink of an eye, a brief turn of the head. Only his red wagon remained, just a block away from the corner, where his father found it still full of rolled newspapers, an hour and 45 minutes later, after Lucy returned home alone. By Sunday, August 12, 1984, when another boy disappeared under identical circumstances, Matthew Klein had been missing for 756 days. Chapter 1, Sunday, August 12, 1984, 1 hour missing. In the early morning darkness of a South Side Des Moines neighborhood, 12-year-old Sammy Cox ran down Clark Avenue as fast as his short, thick legs would take him. He glanced over his shoulder and saw that no one was following him anymore, but continued running anyway. He clutched his empty canvas newspaper delivery bag to his side and the keys hanging around his neck on a string bounced wildly off his chest. His heart hammered until it felt as if it were going to punch a hole right through his ribs, but he kept running. If he stopped, he might get caught again. At the New Hope Baptist Church on the corner of Clark and 10th Street, he crossed the yard, the dry grass crunching beneath his sneakers, and ran straight to the east door of the church. The east door was always left unlocked on Sunday mornings by the pastor, who arrived without fail by 8 a.m. to sit in his office and practice his sermon. Sammy had hidden in the church before. He knew it would be safe. He opened the door and soundlessly entered the hallway, tiptoeing by the pale shaft of light illuminating the bottom of the pastor's office door, and let himself into the dark fellowship hall. There he crawled beneath one of the linen-covered tables and waited. He tried to make himself invisible. Stinging beads of sweat dripped into his eyes. The fleshy skin of his upper arm was already starting to hurt where fingers had squeezed and pinched. Sammy gently brushed his fingertips over the tender spots just below the sleeve hem of his shirt and winced. He barely escaped this time by wrenching his arm free and making a run for it. Sammy touched the fabric at the crotch of his shorts. He'd wet his pants again during the struggle. He knew he was never supposed to run away, that he'd probably be punished for it later, but he didn't care. Sammy hated Sundays, and he hated the Sunday paper route. He constantly begged his mother to let him quit, but she'd gently remind him that he needed the exercise to lose the weight he'd put on recently, that some extra responsibility one morning a week was good for him, that he should be grateful to even have the job. She would just repeat what someone else had told her. A door banged in the hallway, and Sammy tensed. He removed a pair of his mother's orange-handled scissors from the bottom of his canvas bag and gripped the blades, ready. He held his breath, straining to listen. A cough. It was only the pastor moving around. The office door closed, and Sammy exhaled. He slipped the scissors back into the bag. Sammy crawled out from beneath the table. The fellowship hall was still empty. He scanned the trays of cellophane-covered cookies the church ladies usually put out the night before Sunday services. The choices today: Fig Newtons, generic vanilla cream sandwiches, and an assortment of homemade chocolate chip cookies. A small platter of Keebler fudge stripes caught his eye. He lifted a corner of the clear plastic and grabbed a handful. He then artfully rearranged the remaining cookies to cover the bare spots. Back beneath the table, he slipped his index finger through a center hole and began to nibble bits around the edges, the best way to eat a fudge stripe. He would eat his cookies and then go. On several of the Sunday mornings before he'd begun to hide in the church, he considered trying to make a run for home, but knew he couldn't make it. He got winded easily and barely ran fast enough to make it to the church. His house was still several blocks away, and the streets on the south side were hilly. His older sister Crystal was a pretty good runner, but Sammy was chubby and slow and weak. It wasn't fair. Sammy rubbed the tender marks on his arm once more. For a brief moment, he thought about knocking on the office door and asking the pastor for help, telling him what had been happening since last fall. He imagined the pastor calling the police, or maybe the FBI. There would be questions, interrogations, and Sammy would have to talk about it. He'd be forced to tell all the terrible details that made his stomach feel slimy just thinking about them. Sammy wiped cookie crumbs from his chin and wrapped his arms around his belly. No, he could never tell anyone again. It was a secret, he'd promised, crossed his heart and hoped to die, and he didn't want to die. And besides, when he'd tried telling before, nothing had happened, nothing had changed. So he would keep trying to get away whenever he could. He would keep carrying the scissors on Sunday mornings. Maybe one day he would finally be brave enough to use them. Sammy slid another cookie over his finger and peeked beneath the tablecloth to check if the coast was clear. When he emerged, he noticed a long chocolate milk stain bisecting the front of his white I'm a Pepper t-shirt from drinking out of the carton earlier that morning. His father used to drink out of the carton. He said chocolate milk somehow tasted better that way. Sammy agreed. He missed his father. Florida was so far away. He pulled his white, red his white and red striped tube socks up to his knees and left the fellowship hall as quietly as he'd entered. He needed to get home, or he would be late. And if he was too late, his mother would notice and scold him for dawdling and taking too long on his route. Outside, the full sun crested the horizon. The streets were busier at this hour than normal. Passing cars, several people out walking, calling to each other. Sammy clutched his canvas bag in front of the wet spot on his crotch and dashed across the street to the churchyard, to the sidewalk. As he was about to cross the street, he stopped and waited for two speeding motorcycles to pass. They slowed at the top of the hill, then stopped. A group of people crowded around the corner of 10th and Hillcrest, where one of the other paperboys had his bundles delivered. Sammy started running again to make up time, but instead of turning right on 10th and walking just 1 block north to Cutler Avenue where he lived, the shortest and most direct path home, he crossed 10th and continued west to Clark. It took him on a wide circular route to his street, his safety route, a route where no one would think to look for him, where he would be a little safer. All right, so that is the prologue and chapter 1. And so I'm going to try and talk and read questions from the chat at the same time. We'll see how this goes. Okay, so, oh my gosh, I see so many names on here I recognize. All these friends, and okay, this is pretty cool. Anyway, and I'm still talking to myself. Okay, so Raquel just posted a question about the writing process with this particular novel. So I started writing this novel back in 2000, it would have been 2014. And I think I spent roughly 4 years total working on it. I spent a couple months doing all the research on the real cases. Even though the cases in the book are fictional, I wanted to use as many facts as possible to sort of honor the real cases that occurred here in Des Moines. And so I started by researching all the old Des Moines Register newspaper articles down at the Des Moines Public Library, their central location. And there were hundreds because both the Gosh and Martin cases were, they were huge news stories here in Iowa. So I started by just hours and hours reading through all those old newspaper articles and kind of getting the timelines and the facts down. But also at the same time, because it was old newspapers, it really helped me get a sense of like the 80s at that time in the Midwest. You know, like the newspapers had TV guides in them and what movies were playing at the local theaters that week. Even though I was a kid in the 80s at the time, these cases happened, it was a great refresher and really put me back in that era when these cases happened. So after a couple months of research, reading articles, things like that, I tracked down one of the original investigators on the Eugene Martin case, the second case, a man named Officer Jim Rowley, and he was generous and met with me several times, let me interview him extensively, and I got all kinds of interesting details from him about the Eugene Martin case and a little bit on the Mark Allen case. And my talks with him were so fascinating that he ended up inspiring a new character in the book that originally wasn't in the story that I had envisioned. So the character of Sergeant Dale Goodkind is very loosely based on Jim Rowley and some of the stories he told me about in his time working as an officer for the Des Moines Police Department. And then after I had enough research compiled, I had to sort of cut myself off because research can be a great distraction. It's a total rabbit hole. I can spend and waste a lot of time researching and not actually writing. So I gave myself 2 months and then I started writing the first draft. And my early drafts are always very messy and resemble very little of what the final book actually ends up looking like. I think I saw, so I see Rich Farrell's on here commenting. Hi, Rich. Like, so for example, Rich read one of the very early drafts. I think he read like 50 pages, maybe 100 pages of one of the early drafts. And in that draft, I had this huge cast of characters. I think I had 6, 7 point of view characters at the time. Way too many. It was nuts. And Rich talked me out of it and told me to pare it down and streamline the point of view. So thank you, Rich. So that does cause my first drafts to take quite a while. That process is a little long. And then I end up revising many, many times. I think I went total revision with this book, probably 10 drafts, maybe 12, which is pretty common for me, which is also why it takes me so long to get through books, 3-4 years. So that was the writing process of this one. Oh, hi, Eileen. So Eileen, she's a writer friend of mine here in Des Moines. She asked if Noreen Gosh spoke to me during my research into the real cases. So Noreen Gosh was Johnny Gosh's mother, and she has become a pretty well-known figure in the world of child abduction and missing child cases. And so I actually did not speak to her. She does not do, as a rule, she does not do interviews anymore. She doesn't answer emails anymore. She's pretty firm about that. And as it turned out, the structure of the plot ended up, I didn't use much of the Johnny Gosh case. I really ended up centering the book around the Eugene Martin case, the fictionalized version of the Eugene Martin case, because that was actually the case that I remembered and that had significance to me personally, because the weekend Eugene Martin went missing, I was actually in Des Moines on a weekend trip with my family. I lived 2 hours south on a farm in a small town. My parents were dairy farmers, and a trip to Des Moines was pretty rare for us. But on August 12th, 1984, we were in Des Moines, staying in a hotel on the south side the morning Eugene Martin went missing, and he went missing on my sister's 14th birthday. And so that is the case that left the biggest impression on me. And I remember standing in the parking lot of the motel after the news broke about Eugene Martin and looking out at the Des Moines skyline and thinking to myself that someone out there was stealing children. And I never knew that was even a thing, like that could even happen. I'd had quite a sheltered experience up to that point. And so that's the case that resonated the most with me, I think haunted me the most, and that's the bulk of the fictional story is built around that case. And I did not interview Eugene's family either, because all of his family, his dad, his stepmother, and his mother, they all passed away many years ago. And all his siblings have kind of scattered. So there's not a lot of Eugene's family left in the Des Moines area either. But I was introduced to and interviewed a man he's now an adult, lives in the Des Moines area, but as a child, he lived in a small town north of Des Moines, and he had, when he was 11, he had an evening paper route once a week. And one evening he suffered a very violent abduction and horrible assault on his paper route, and miraculously survived. And he did visit with me and very graciously shared his harrowing story about how the abduction happened, how quickly it happened, the assault, and then the aftermath when he made it back home. And his story was so interesting, I ended up incorporating part of it into the book. If any of you have read the book already, the scene where Sergeant Dale Goodkind is kind of imagining, he's trying to work it out in his head, how someone could get a boy into a car without any screams or yelling or tussling or witnesses hearing or seeing something in these neighborhoods. And after I heard Charlie's story, I then had a full understanding of how fast a child could be pulled through an open window and incapacitated. And so that inspired a scene, one of the scenes in the book. So Raquel asked, was doing the research for this one different from the other books and stories you've written? I imagine this topic was also pretty heavy since it was based on true cases. Yeah, the research for this book was very different because I knew from the beginning I wanted to honor many of the facts of the real cases, because those cases are so significant here in Iowa. Anyone who grew up in the era of the paperboy abductions was affected by them well into their adulthood, and how we now all parent our children. So I had to do a lot more research. I had to be a lot more diligent about getting which facts I wanted to use, and then building a fictional plot around those facts, which made it a little more challenging than sort of starting from scratch and building a plot sort of how I wanted. And it was it took a lot more time to do the research and interviews and all the other things that went into it. And I'm pretty used to writing kind of dark material. My first two books had very heavy, dark subject matter. So that's kind of my taste. It's my thing, like I am what I am. I can't help it. So I've just learned to accept and embrace it and understand that some readers, it's not for every reader, for some readers, and everyone finds their place. So I can generally work on dark subject matter for a long time and it doesn't really bother me. I don't know what that says about me though, but so anyway. So what was the hardest scene to write? For sure the ending. I got to the ending and I knew what was going to happen. I'm going to try and not spoil it, though I'm not known for keeping secrets very well. So at one point I'll probably blab it. I'm going to try not to. But there's a violent scene at the end, and I knew the violent scene was going to happen, and I knew the outcome of this one particular character, what the outcome was going to be for this one particular character, but I struggled to decide who was going to deliver that outcome, and I rewrote that scene several times and had other characters delivering the outcome at different points before I finally realized and accepted which character it was who had to deliver that outcome. And so once I knew which character it was going to be to deliver the violent outcome, and I had to write that scene, that was a tough scene to write. And I'm not a big believer in, for me personally, I don't want to spend a lot of time writing incredibly gruesome or graphic passages. But, I went as far as I felt, got the scene across and captured the moment. Yeah. Okay, so this is a question from Matt Masucci. Matt was one of my students years ago at Lindenwood, in the MFA program at Lindenwood, and he's now a college professor himself. So he asked, as a writer, teacher, and parent, how do you handle the work-life parenting balance? Do you have writing routines, places you go to work pre-COVID anyway? So because I teach the MFA program I teach for is online, I'm pretty free to structure my day how I want to. It's asynchronous, so myself and my students can log in and do their work anytime that fits their schedule. So I've been able to set up a pretty sweet schedule where I do all my writing in the morning. I usually get up around 8, write till noon, or I'm in my office, ready to start writing from 8 till about noon, take a lunch break, and then I teach from like 1:30 to 4:30 or 5 in the afternoons. And it's been a pretty good balance. I have a dedicated office. I'm pretty lucky in a home office where I can work, close the doors. COVID has been a little bit of an adjustment because now my husband's working from home. Our daughter has been home from school since March, and even now she's only going every other day on this hybrid schedule. So it's a lot noisier. I get a lot more interruptions, but we're dealing with it like everybody else. Okay, so Robin, hi Robin Oliver, she was so sweet. She gave me a nice review blurb early on, before the book even sold. I so appreciated that. So appreciated that. She asked if I had considered writing a nonfiction book about the subject instead. I did. At one point, I was struggling with the plot, with one of the drafts. I was very close to giving up on it. It just wasn't coming together. I just couldn't figure out how to fix the issues in the plot. And at one point, I thought maybe I really just need to write a nonfiction book profiling the cases. And as much as I considered it, then I thought, well, they've been covered pretty extensively. Noreen Gosh wrote about it herself, her son's case. They've been covered in documentaries. There was a big documentary in 2014 about the cases. And then I kept coming back to I couldn't let the fictional characters go. So I returned to the novel and just kept hammering away at it until I finally had a breakthrough. That said, over the summer, I started with the delay in the publication and, my family home, and it was kind of noisy and hard to concentrate around here. I've done a lot of nonfiction writing this summer. So I got this kind of weird gig writing for the A&E network, the A&E television network. They have a blog series on their website called Real Crime. And I got connected with an editor there, and pitched them the story, the real Des Moines paperboy stories, and they picked it up and now are giving me assignments to keep writing real crime reporting for them. So a couple weeks ago, the paperboy article came out that I wrote on their blog, and then right now I'm working on another one for them on the Jody Huisentruit disappearance. Iowans probably recognize that name. She was a reporter in Mason City, Iowa, and was violently abducted one morning on her way to a broadcast and was never found. It's been this huge mystery. So it's kind of nice to do a little nonfiction writing in between novel projects. They're just shorter, easier to crank out. And it turns out I kind of like mixing it up with some nonfiction in there. So it's worked out pretty well. This is from my friend Tracy, another fabulous writer here in the Des Moines area. She asked, since this is a balance between fiction and true crime, what kind of takeaways do you hope readers have? So with true crime, what I found that I love so much about using true crime, even in fiction, is that I feel like big cases that get a lot of attention, whether it's today or in the 1980s, they often almost are like a commentary on life and society at that time, or that town, or that area, or that place. And the paperboy cases were absolutely an example of what I'm talking about and what I ended up kind of exploring in the story. That in the 80s, all through the 80s and into the early 90s, we went through this really strange obsession with stranger danger, that there were these child molesters and abductors on every single corner. And I can remember as a child myself being terrified of white vans. Like, white vans were the devil. There were murderers and child abductors in every single white van. You never approached a white van that you didn't know. And it was a really kind of weird decade of believing that child abductors and children were getting snatched off streets every day, when in reality now we know statistically the number was actually extremely small. Stranger abductions were actually incredibly small. but these huge inflated cases that got so much attention kind of gave the illusion that it was a much bigger problem than it was. And the sort of unfortunate effect of that was that children who were maybe being abused or sexually abused by someone they knew, which was a lot more common, a friend of the family, a neighbor, someone in the community, those were much more common, and those were the cases that really don't get a lot of attention and don't necessarily get reported the way they should. So I think that's sort of where I got my taste for true crime. I like getting into cases and figuring out how did this affect? What does this say about our society and our world? The commentary on there. And I think I found my sweet spot with it. The next book I'm working on is also true crime, based on another, loosely based on another Iowa case. So I think I found my sweet spot, I think. Okay, so this is for my friend Sally. Hi, Sally. Do you have some new characters wanting to be written? I have started a new book. I'm maybe halfway through the first draft, and already it's kind of a hot mess. But this is a character I have been thinking about for years. The main character of this story. I've had him kind of banging around in my head for, I think, 5 years. I heard this story about a real person, a friend of mine told me about it, and I thought, oh, that would be a great character to write in a story. So I've been sitting on him for a long time, and I just finally started writing it in the last year or so. And then I always have kind of notes scribbled everywhere, ideas of stories I'd like to try and write and get to at some point. If I wish I could write faster. That would help me a lot. But yeah, so I've always got a character in there somewhere bugging me that I can start writing on down the road. Okay, so this one is, your characters' voices were distinctively their own. What is the trick to not have characters sound too similar? That's a good question. I think sometimes it's easy in early drafts when you don't maybe know your characters really well just yet, that they all kind of sound alike. And I think I don't really have a trick. I don't know that anyone has a trick. I think part of it is just diligence in getting to know your characters as deeply and as well as you can. And as drafts go on, as you get deeper into drafts, you get to know them better, you understand them better, and in recognizing that, then you know you're going to have to go back to those early chapters, those early pages, and do big rewrites, because the voice will evolve and change. Those characters' voices will evolve and change because they'll get better as you go. And I use a really great writing exercise from a writer named Julia Fierro. I think it's called Get Closer. That's the name of the exercise. Get closer to your characters. And I found the exercise in this great craft book called Naming the World by Brett Anthony Johnston. And Julia created this questionnaire that she recommends you ask every character. And it's very detailed, it's very in-depth, and I've started using it with every new book, every new story I write, and I fill it out for all my characters just to help me get to know them better and understand them better. All the information that you end up jotting down in the questionnaire you may not use, but I think you internalize the answers and feel like you're understanding this character better. You're getting to know them better. And this is a very minor example. So in the book, the character Sergeant Dale Goodkind, he's kind of stiff and serious and very buttoned up, and he gets teased about how serious he is all the time. And that part of his personality, of his character, came out when I was working on that questionnaire. one of the questions was, what is a favorite story people like to tell about this character? And I started jotting down that, oh, well, Dale is always punctual. He's so punctual, he was actually born on his due date. And that's where that all started, that, oh, I think he's very serious. I think he's no nonsense. He doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke. He's a little uptight, maybe. And then once I knew that about him, it kind of started informing how he talked, how he moved, what things annoy him, what things he likes. So that's how I work. I think every writer probably works differently, but this technique has worked pretty well for me. Yeah. Oh, okay. So Shishwan, how are you? It's nice to see you here. Thanks for tuning in. She asked, can you indulge us with what's your next project? Will it be more like The Good Divide or The Monsters We Make, or completely different? You seem to navigate between the genres so effortlessly. Well, that's really sweet of you to think anything I do is effortless. That's really sweet, because it's 100% not true. So the next book I'm working on is also a domestic crime. It's kind of in the true crime family, a little more mystery maybe than I've written in the past. So it'll fit sort of more into the family of The Monsters We Make. It's based off of a murder case from kind of the area I grew up in. It's the Lisa Teckel murder. And it has this very strong mental health thread in it. Which is a real passion area of mine. After a few years ago, those of you who know me, you're familiar with this story, but in 2017, our neighbors who live across the street, longtime neighbors, we'd lived next to them for like 15 years, knew the family very well. It was a husband, wife, and their 24-year-old daughter were tragically murdered in their home by their son, who was very mentally ill. He had undertreated schizophrenia and bipolar, and he had a psychotic break one night and tragically killed his family, and is now serving 3 consecutive life sentences. But after that incident happened, I learned more about what the struggle they had gone through to try and get their son help. Here in Iowa, our mental health care system at that time had been gutted. In 2017, it was a mess. Funding had been cut, and we had 2 state hospitals close. We ranked 50th, dead last in all of the United States for number of beds available for patients, mental health patients who were in acute crisis. And the week of the murders, the young man, his name is Chase, his family had taken him to the hospital begging for him to be admitted somewhere, and there wasn't a single bed available in the entire state. And 5 days later, he killed his family. So after I really got to know some of the details behind the case and what the family had gone through and stuff, I got very involved with mental health care reform in legislation and advocacy work, and I joined NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And I've learned a lot. I've met some really amazing families through NAMI. I did some writing for the Des Moines Register about the state of mental health care here in Iowa, and was inspired enough that it ended up becoming a huge piece of the new book I'm working on. So it kind of merged these two things, the mental health care aspect and then this true crime murder case that had a mental health thread to it, and they just sort of came together, and I started, and the plot just kind of took off. So that's what I've been working on here lately. So Raquel asked, you mentioned almost always giving up on the draft. What advice would you give a writer who has worked on a project forever and wanted to give up? Well, just don't give up. There is no other way around it. The truth is I hardly know a writer who hasn't struggled and flailed against a book that they've been working on. I just don't know that many writers who are like, yeah, I wrote the first draft in 6 weeks and I did a light revision and HarperCollins bought it 2 days later. That just doesn't really happen. It's most writers, they write this really crappy first draft and then they have to go back and start reworking it and revise it. And revisions can sometimes be years. I mean, they are for me. When I get to the lowest, when I get really low with a draft, I just have to step away from it. I have found that working on other genres has been very therapeutic. Maybe I'll turn my attention to a short story or an essay or some sort of nonfiction writing. I do some editing too for different places. Just something that's not the book. And I do use beta readers. I have a few. I've had writers groups in the past, although they've all sort of disbanded in the last few years. But I have a writing partner. My friend Julie and I, we get together well before COVID. We used to get together like every other week, and we would do write-ins together. Sometimes we would kind of problem solve with each other, bounce ideas off of each other. I've used, like I said, I had early on, with this book, I sent a draft to my friend Rich when I was really stuck. And Rich kind of gave me the hard thing I needed to hear, that I knew myself, but I wasn't doing yet, where he was like, I think you have too many point of view characters, quite honestly. And I was like, okay, yeah, he's right. Okay, I need to cut like 3 whole characters and 2 whole storylines. This is out of control. And just reminding yourself that novels are marathons, and marathons are painful. This sounds terrible. It makes it sound like, well, why would you ever want to write novels? That sounds horrible. Well, it kind of is. I mean, that's just sort of how novels are. They're just kind of horrible to write at a certain point. So I say, if you're struggling and feeling like at any point you're like, I don't know if I can finish this, I may give up. Yeah, that sounds about right. I would say you're doing your job. It's going as it should. Okay, so Raquel asked me, fun question, coffee or tea? Favorite writer drink? Ooh. So I have to drink coffee in the morning. I am not even coherent without coffee in the morning. I do switch to, I usually drink water in the afternoon, which is really adult. Like, water's so boring. And then my favorite writer drink, so at night, a good glass of wine, a good glass of red wine. So hobbies outside of writing, I'm a terrible cook. I'm not a great cook. I'm not a great baker. I find working in the kitchen really stressful, but I do like to garden. I'm pretty good at gardening, which is a nice sort of opposite antidote to sitting all day and working on a computer and writing. Oh yeah, and I see Matt just posted Naming the World by Brett Anthony Johnston, and Julia Fierro. Her fabulous character questionnaire is in that book. It's a great book on writing. So I've been trying to read as I go. Oh, I see my cousin chimed in here. My cousin Hope, who was she was a paper girl until 1983 in Coralville, Iowa. Oh yeah, the worst part for me was collecting money from people at their houses and apartments. I did interview a couple former paper carriers who were children in Des Moines at the time, and they talked about that very thing, having to go up to the houses and collect money, and then especially after the Eugene Martin abduction, they had to start using a buddy system and carrying flashlights and whistles and all this stuff, and eventually people just stopped. letting their kids be paper carriers, and newspapers determined it was too much of a liability. So they started moving to adult. They usually toss them from car windows, and they now contract them out. You don't see kids delivering papers anymore. That kind of ended after that 1980s era. So Matt posted one last comment. Oh, he got the Ben Percy book, Thrill Me, after I talked about it in one of our workshop classes in grad school. Such a great writing book. I love that it covers things beyond beginner suggestions. I have notes from it on my tack board. Yes, so the other book I regularly teach is a craft book by a writer named Benjamin Percy. It's called Thrill Me. It's phenomenal. It's one of my other favorite craft books that I regularly teach and use myself. That and Naming the World. And then there's a third that I really like. It's Naming the World by David Joss. Another phenomenal book on writing. He has stuff in there about point of view. One of the few essays on that really breaks down point of view, and he's got a chapter on there about putting short story collections together, like how you order the stories and things like that. I teach that essay a lot because it's really helpful for short story writers. So the monsters we make. This one is under my maiden name. I just saw my friend Carol asked why it was under Callie White, not Callie Bimbali. So I kind of changed genres. I changed publishers, I changed agents, and the new publisher was like, well, it's kind of mystery, crime fiction, and that genre really likes to have shorter, easier names to remember and spell. And Benbali is, nobody ever remembers how to pronounce it. It's even harder to spell. So they asked me to use a pen name. And so I finally agreed, and we compromised. I kept my first name, and I just used my maiden name because, if you can't remember or spell White, I can't help you. So that's how I ended up with my maiden name. My husband is fine. He's still around. We're still together. It's not a reflection of him or anything like that. It was totally a business thing. It is confusing though, and it made my website a mess, but that's a whole nother web talk. And I'll say this, my friend Merle asked about what did Troy think of the name change. I'll tell you, the first time I published my first book, I had to fill out my copyright information, and I told Troy, I kind of maybe want to, use both my maiden name and my married name. It's my family name, right? And his feelings were a little bit hurt. This was like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, something like that. He was like, but you're a Bimbali, where, it's the name, our kids have the last name. And he kind of took it a little bit personally. Well, fast forward 15, 20 years, and all the struggle of writing and trying to publish. And I was like, Troy, they want me to change my name. And he was like, do it. Do whatever they ask. I don't care. Who cares? If they want you to write under Humpty Dumpty, publish under Humpty Dumpty. If that's what it'll take to get the book deal. So, oh, how we all evolve, right? I think that's all the questions. Oh, what was David Joss's title again? Naming the World. It goes under two names. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Alone with All That Could Happen is Dave's book, but it's also been reprinted under a different title. Just simply, it's called On Writing Fiction. Jody, thank you, Jody. She just posted a link to it. On Writing Fiction. It's the exact same book as Alone with All That Could Happen. They just gave it a different title when they reprinted it. Loaded with all kinds of fantastic craft essays in there. Okay, I think that looks like that's all the questions for now. We're just right about at the hour, so I'm going to let everyone go. Thank you for tuning in. This has been a very weird experience. I have no idea how this went or how I looked or who's watching, but for those of you I can see in the chat, thank you so much. And thank you, Raquel and Writers Atelier, for setting this up for me and making this happen. And everyone, thank you for buying the book, reading the book. I'm always humbled by that. Anyone who gives any time to books, thank you. And everyone, enjoy your evening.